So, what if you could make a perfect copy of a living being? I don't just mean a twin, but a complete genetic replica, born years later. It sounds like something straight out of science fiction, right? But for two tiny monkeys, this became their reality. And it kicked off both a scientific revolution and, well, a pretty profound ethical crisis. Let's get into how it all happened. Okay, so say hello to Zhong-Zhong and Hua-Hua. They were born at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and their arrival, it wasn't just another birth announcement. No, this was a massive moment in science, one that smashed through a barrier that had stood for over 20 years. And here's the reason why. They are the first primates ever to be cloned using a technique called Somatic Cell Nuclear Transfer, or SCNT. Now, if that sounds familiar, it should. It's the exact same method that created the world's most famous sheep, Dolly, way back in 1996. So a technique that worked on sheep had finally worked on primates, our closest relatives. But the big question is, why on earth did it take so long? And that question, well, it brings us to a genuine scientific mystery. For 2 whole decades, trying to clone a primate with this method seemed completely and utterly impossible. Honestly, researchers were really starting to lose hope. Now, check this out, because this timeline really shows you the scale of the struggle. After Dolly in '96, scientists went on this cloning spree. They cloned more than 20 other species. We're talking cats, dogs, cows, you name it. But primates? Nope. It just consistently failed. For 20 years, every single attempt was a dead end, creating this massive, frustrating gap in the cloning timeline. The failures were so consistent, so relentless, that a lot of scientists, including the lead researcher Chang's son, began to think there was some fundamental biological wall they just couldn't get past. The leading theory was that primate cells were just too complicated, their genetic programming too stubborn to be reset. But then, the team in China had a breakthrough. They figured it out. They found the key to finally unlock that primate mystery. Okay, so first, a super quick refresher on the technique itself. Somatic Cell Nuclear Transfer. The simple version is this. You take a regular body cell, so not a sperm or an egg, and you take its nucleus, which has all the DNA. Then you pop that nucleus into an egg cell after you've taken the egg's original nucleus out. Presto, this new egg can now, theoretically, develop into a perfect genetic copy of the animal that donated the nucleus. So, how do they finally get this to work for primates? Well, the first couple steps are pretty standard. You take the nucleus out of a healthy monkey egg and you insert a new one from a fetal cell. But step three is where the magic happened. This was the breakthrough. The scientists added this special cocktail of molecules they called epigenetic modulators. So think of DNA as this giant instruction manual. These modulators, they acted like a software update, telling the cell which specific chapters it needed to read to build an embryo from scratch, chapters that were switched off in the original body cell. It was this brilliant chemical trick that was the key. It unlocked everything. So this success was celebrated everywhere as a true miracle of science. But as we're about to see, that miracle pretty quickly led researchers, and all of us really, into a deeply, deeply troubling ethical minefield. I mean, this slide really captures the whole long journey, doesn't it? On one side, you have the pioneer, Dolly, and on the other, her primate successors, Zhong-Zhong and Hua-Hua. These two images are separated by 2 decades of nothing but trial and error. It really was a monumental leap in what we thought was biologically possible. But that success was a long way from perfect. The process was incredibly inefficient. To get these 2 healthy baby monkeys, the team had to implant 21 embryos into surrogate mothers. Only 6 of those even resulted in a pregnancy, and only 2 made it to a live birth. Just 2. And then things took an even darker turn, just 1 year later. The same team took their breakthrough and pushed it a huge step further. This time, they didn't just clone a monkey. They cloned a monkey that they had first genetically engineered to have a severe disorder with its internal body clock. The results were, frankly, pretty disturbing. These 5 cloned monkeys were essentially born into a life of suffering. They showed severe psychological symptoms. They couldn't sleep, they were anxious, depressed, and even exhibited behaviors that looked a lot like schizophrenia in humans. The scientific community was absolutely stunned. The experiment was immediately labeled exactly what you see right here, a horrifying ethical minefield. That scientific miracle had turned into a
full-blown moral crisis in just 12 short months.
So all of this, it raises these profound questions that go way, way beyond the lab. If we can create a copy of a living being, what does that say about our own identity? What does it actually mean to be an individual? This really brings us to two totally different ways of thinking about what a clone is. The common fear is rooted in something called genetic determinism, this idea that our genes are our destiny, which would make a clone just a carbon copy. But the reality, it's so much more complex. Philosophers, scientists, they mostly agree that who we are is this complicated mix of genes, our environment, and all our unique experiences. So a clone isn't really a copy. It's more like a later-born identical twin who's destined to live their own completely unique life. As the philosopher Dan Brock put it so well, a mirror can show you the genetic similarities, sure, but it can never, ever reflect the unique choices, the memories, and the experiences that truly make someone who they are. But there is a very compelling counterargument. The bioethicist Leon Koss argues that a clone is burdened because it knows its genetic path has already been walked by someone else. A clone is, in his powerful words, saddled with a genotype that has already lived, and that could create this immense psychological weight of expectation, of comparison. Cass is actually famous for coining this term, the wisdom of repugnance. His argument is that the deep, gut-level feeling of horror that so many of us have when we think about human cloning, it isn't just an irrational fear. He suggests it might actually be a form of deep moral intuition, a signal that we're about to cross a fundamental line and violate something essential about what it means to be human. So, where does all this leave us? Well, the technology is here, that's a fact. But its future remains completely and maybe terrifyingly unwritten. Now, the scientists behind this work, they're very clear about their stated goals. They want to create whole populations of genetically identical monkeys to serve as perfect models for studying really devastating human diseases, things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and cancer. The idea is to test new drugs with incredible precision. And yet, we have to ask the hard question. Does this very well-intentioned goal justify turning intelligent, sensitive creatures into, well, disposable tools? It puts the promise of medical progress in direct conflict with the moral status of these animals who are, let's be honest, so much like us. Ultimately, the story of Zhong-Zhong and Hua-Hua holds up a mirror to us. It forces us to confront one of the most challenging questions of our time. As we gain this almost unbelievable power to replicate life, at what cost do we pursue the biological mastery of our own image?